Good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending our Iowa Ideas Conference. My name is Brittney Miller, and I'm the Energy and Environment Reporter at the Gazette, and I'll be moderating this panel about solar energy in Iowa. This session is within the Energy and Environment track. All of our sessions have closed captioning access and are all being recorded. Before we start, I want to take a moment to thank Alliant Energy for sponsoring our Energy and Environment track. Please join me in watching a quick message from them. Awesome. Thank you, Elaine. Now I'm thrilled to introduce our three panelists for the session. Sara Alden is a Linn County resident who created the website and group Iowans for Responsible Solar, which advocates for the responsible siting of industrial scale solar installations. Justin Foss is a strategic project manager for Alliant Energy. He leads a team focused on developing solar, storage, and wind energy projects in Iowa. Sean Kennedy is the president of Megawatt, a company that develops utility-scale solar farms in several states, including Iowa and Michigan. Megawatt is developing the Johnson County Solar Triangle Project. So thank you all for being here. There will be a short Q&A session with the audience at the end of the session. Feel free to post your questions on Whova, and I can dictate them to the panelists as time allows. And now let's start with our discussion. To start off, I kind of want to go over the basics of solar energy to kind of set the foundation for our discussion. So can we talk about how it works and how does it compare to other types of energy generation? Whoever wants to start off there.
Well, maybe I'll start. So solar energy works in essence from the sun's rays come down to the solar panels that are installed. And it creates a current, DC, direct current, and that is then sent to overall transformers, who change that from a DC to an AC current, which is what we power all of our homes and businesses with. And that transformer then sends it to a substation, and then from that substation, it sends it off to the power grid. So when we're thinking about utility scale solar, it comes from that substation off to the power grid. When you have it on your home, it comes from your home directly behind your meter, directly to your to the appliances that you have in your house, and anything extra goes back through the meter off to the overall power grid again. It is one of many resources that utilities have to generate electricity from, and is one of the newer, but is not new resources.
Sean, did you want to add anything?
Well, I'll add to that there's many kinds of power plants. We all know about nuclear power plants, and we know about gas-fired power plants and coal-fired power plants. Solar energy or a wind turbine, they're just another type of power plant. So the utilities have power plants. They produce a lot of power. People have small power plants at their houses that they've got a backup generator. They might even have one in their garage to run the refrigerator if the power goes out. So you've got to think of this in terms of what are the generating assets that we need in the community, and how much of it should be large utility and how much should be what we call distributed generation, which is power plants that are very localized for a few houses or for one house or for a hog confinement facility. So that's what I'd add.
Mm-hmm.
I would say for me, when I think about energy, I think about utility scale and also personal use energy. And, we do have many options for electrical generation. For utility scale, nuclear, I think is our best option. And I say that just because all energy has a cost and a waste, but nuclear energy is carbon free, and it also is consistent and reliable. It has a large power density comparative to like gas, coal, wind, and solar. So that is something that is reliable and consistent. When you look at like gas power and coal power plants, those can respond quickly when we need additional energy because of, everyone's running their air conditioner in the summertime. We have a higher demand. Those power plants can be brought online and utilized for that. Wind and solar do produce power. I will say, just looking at data from the energy website, the government site, the EIA, it's intermittent and it's inconsistent in terms of output seasonally. So we do need to take that into consideration as we start to take down some of these stable forms of electricity, and know that, as a community and as a modern society, that our electrical consumption continues to grow. And so how is that managed?
Yeah, Sarah, I agree with you 1,000% on the fact that we need to manage that. And speaking, as a utility provider that is responsible for doing that, I can speak for all utility providers in that providing reliable energy is job number one. Everything else comes after that. So if we are able to accept that that's job number one, all of the plans that we make, we feel support that. And so that's where it's on the utility, but also on individuals to understand how things are changing. And that job number one is reliable power, and that everything that the utilities are proposing accomplishes that goal. It's in a way that we've not seen before. Traditionally, the power in Iowa, was all coal fired, because that's where that's the closest resource that we had. We have coal mines that are now retired in southern Iowa and across the state. So we used coal from Iowa, and there was a little bit of hydro at the beginning of the electrical grid here in Iowa. That has shifted as technology has changed to now, instead of relying on coal and some hydro, to having a diverse mix of energy resources that provide different benefits, and of course have different concerns, but also have that mix of benefits for customers, provide that reliable power that's both cost effective and has as little emissions as possible.
Reliability is not only time of day reliability, it is extreme weather event reliability. You probably all saw that during Hurricane Ian, the only community that kept their power on throughout it was a community that had what's called an islanded microgrid, where basically they were able to run off their sun, their battery generation. There's a lot to be said for distributed generation, having it localized, and the resiliency that comes from that. And there may be a thought about extreme weather events and the effect on production of solar power. But after the derecho here, there was no significant damage to the solar projects that were already installed in the state. So it is a very reliable source of power, solar.
On the topic of reliability, we used to have a nuclear facility in Palo that was operational, that provided the community with 640 megawatts of electricity 24/7. It was actually rated excellent, which is, I understand, the highest standard that a nuclear facility can get. And that was rated or graded by the Nuclear Power or the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations and the World Association of Nuclear Operators. We have a world-class facility here in Palo. The NRC had given that an operational license until February of 2034. So when we talk about reliable energy, I don't see anything better than the nuclear facility that we had here. So it's voluntarily premature shutdown, I think was a business decision and not necessarily what was best for reliable energy if we're looking at that number one concept of providing reliable energy.
The problem is the plant is now gone, and siting a new plant is a 20 or 25-year odyssey and very difficult to do. So we've got a real clear and present danger with climate change, and we need to change how we produce our power now. I feel like solar siting takes an awful long time, but I accept that. To go through half a lifetime to site a nuclear power plant, I think the climate can't wait.
For the structure, you spoke about the solar facility in Florida with Hurricane Ian. I do want to bring up that is something very interesting to a topic that we as residents in Iowa have brought up, is that building these to critical facility standards, that's very important to secure reliable energy. I'm not sure if the one in Florida was a pivoting installation or not, but we want to make sure that, wind events, that it can survive even at its weakest point, which would be the mobility piece on this structure. I live in the area here near where the former Duane Arnold nuclear facility was, and we had severe wind through the derecho. Power lines snapped in half. I lost a barn. Lots of devastation. Hundreds of trees on my property. And that concentration of destruction wasn't, across the whole area. It was, there were areas that did receive stronger wind damage than others. So just being mindful that we can't really control where that goes, and that we really need to look at critical facility structure if we are switching our dependency in fuel types, and making sure that those facilities will be around when we do experience extreme weather.
You bet. And that's something that utilities and everybody building these needs to take into account. There's a balance, though, between gold plating, something that can never be destroyed, and the costs that are associated with that, and the ability to rebuild quickly. I lived through the derecho. I watched it in my yard here and hit my house as well. And even some of those assets that might be considered, to that extent, the Duane Arnold facility, suffered a critical failure with its cooling towers in that storm. So it's unfair to suggest that solar would have to do that and think that all other resources would survive that when we know that that's just not the truth.
We've mentioned the Duane Arnold facilities, and that, Sara, you mentioned that you live around Palo. The Gazette recently reported about proposed solar projects in Linn County that received mixed feedback from residents, such as the Duane Arnold solar projects near Palo and the Coggin solar project. In your opinions, how do solar projects impact nearby residents, both positively and negatively?
On the positive, they increase local tax revenues, they decrease dust, they create habitat for wildlife. All our projects, we plant a seed mix that is grasses with pollinator flowers, good for pollinators. They overall, I think, make a more pleasant environment, or a pleasant environment to be close to. I think the negatives, with better communication, people will find that they aren't really there for local residents. I know people care about their views. We're very careful about screening and setbacks, and most counties have very good regulations that are well thought out on setbacks and screening. So I don't see negatives that aren't a communications problem.
Justin or Sarah?
Yeah, so I'll start with communication. I would say communication does not happen in the communities where these facilities are being developed. Of course, there's communication with landowners who are choosing to lease land for projects. There's not communication, proactive communication. There's actually instances that I have seen and just unethical behavior with land agents and in the community. It has divided communities. We have friends and some family members who, you know, have been close for decades are not speaking to each other now because of all of this. And this can't be the way that we operate or try to make the world better. You know, I understand that that's one of the reasons why we're doing this, and it is sad, and it's destructive on relationships and communities. In terms of negative impacts to adjacent property owners, you know, definitely it negatively impacts the rural character of the land. I have personally gone to large-scale utility facilities on my own and have seen them for myself. I have talked to neighbors who have participated and those who haven't. In terms of disaster cleanup and long-term responsibility and accountability for the county, you know, those are still some unanswered questions that, you know, no one seems to have the answer to. And because this is all new, I suppose that we will, you know, have to wait and see what happens. But I do have caution and I'm cautious about, you know, promises in the beginning, and we'll see what happens in the end. You know, who's going to be holding the buck at the end, we will see.
You know, I talk to landowners across the state, landowners, farmers, and tenants across the state for projects like this, and I consistently hear there's a box of several buckets of different messages that I consistently hear when we want to go and talk to landowners about this. And part of it depends on where you are in the state, because the same situation might play out in one county and be received completely differently in a different county. And it's kind of what the expectations are. For example, we're developing a project in Lee County where there is no zoning in the county. And the folks who live down there have petitioned the supervisors to not have zoning because they do not want to be told what they can and cannot do with their land. And as such, then they also accept that their neighbor will make decisions on what they want to do with their land without the impact from the neighbors. So you have different differences of opinion and different philosophies in different parts of the state based upon, you know, kind of where you live. But if we think about some of the general feelings that we hear from landowners, when we as a utility come to, or as a developer come to and ask landowners if they want to participate on a project like this, sure, you will get some that say, I've got a lot of land and I would like to reduce my overall risk of hoping for rain and a good growing season. And so I would love to lease part of the land that I have in order to create a more consistent income for my family and my farm operation. We have landowners who say, you know, I'm approaching retirement age and nobody in my family wants to take this on anymore. So if you were to come in and do this and lease my land for a project, it would keep the farm in the family and give that landowner some peace of mind to move forward. We have some landowners who say, you know, I understand what you're trying to do, but my son, my daughter-in-law, my son-in-law, they really want to continue the farming life. And so I understand what you're trying to do, but we don't want to participate because our identity is associated with farming. And so we want to keep that up. We get some landowners who say, man, I wish I could participate because I only own 2 acres here on the corner. Farmer sold me this 2 acres on a 40-acre spot. They say, you know, the farmer sold me this 20 years ago, and this is all I could afford. Man, I'd love to participate, but I can't. And of course, we hear from other, you know, landowners who say, I bought this 2 acres from a farmer on his 40-acre field 10 years ago, and I love looking out and seeing the crops. And then they say, how could you let that other landowner, how could you let that farmer who owns or operates that other 38 acres, how could you let them change the view that I have because I moved out here for that view? And I get it. As I think about where I sit, you know, in suburbia, in the Cedar Rapids area, you know, I don't like looking out my window and seeing my neighbor's house right there. But if I really wanted to do that, I could purchase that lot next to me. Now that'd be very expensive, but it's part of what I have to, you know, what we all have to deal with is that view shed and think about it. And with the ability that we have to kind of control our own destiny. And so in Iowa, what we've seen is a strong piece for property rights. And so to be able to do what you want to do with the land that you own and to be able to have control over that. And we see that discussion playing out over Iowa.
So I think with the view shed piece, you noted the house next door. That I think is something that is expected to see in a neighborhood is another home. When you're out here in the country, I don't know if any of you do live out in the country, but I greatly enjoy it. I get to see the wildlife. I get to watch the crops grow. It's very green out here, you know, except for this time of year, of course, where everything starts to die and turns brown. But it's peaceful, it's open, it's a wonderful place. And, you know, there is a stark difference between the appearance of hundreds of thousands of solar arrays to a field of green corn or soybeans or whatever crop or livestock is living out here in the county. It is something that is expected. I would say an industrialized scene is not something that residents in rural communities are expecting to happen when they do move out here. You know, solar does require a vast amount of land to produce a megawatt. It takes anywhere from 5 to 8 acres of land for 1 megawatt. And the generation that facility has, when you're looking at its annual generation, is an 18% capacity factor. That is astounding to me, that, you know, Iowa has this resource of arable soils where we can do with what we want with crops and growing any type of food. You know, you can raise livestock, you grow hay, all of that is foundational to a lot of the businesses and communities. You know, it's an integral piece that works with a lot of different thousands of products really, that people rely on day to day. And when, you know, you convert that and take those soils out of use, you are now in, you know, it can only be industrial solar. And I have a hard time with, is that really the best value for the community? You know, we are going to pay for these facilities, and the efficiency factor for them is really shocking, I think. You know, when you look at other types of fuel, Here in Lynn County, we already have about 8,000 acres signed into solar lease options. So, I mean, that's something to consider as well too. How much will we convert to utility solar, and are we getting the value as utility customers? We do not have a choice on who our utilities are, and so we need these utility companies to be responsible in the way that they are fueling electricity for the grid. And, quite frankly, taking down a nuclear facility that could perform until 2034, I think is irresponsible. But that's my opinion.
I'd like to say, I think 18% is remarkable. If you take the calories of food you can grow in an acre, convert those to BTUs, and what you have with solar, 18% of the energy that hits an area being used versus wasted. We started out as a state taking care of ourselves. Then we try to feed the nation. Then we try to feed the world. At some point, we decided we'd fuel the world. And 60% of the corn goes for ethanol, which is a very, very inefficient use of the energy that hits the land. Corn is really just another solar energy collector, but it does a very poor job of it compared to solar panels. With an acre of solar panels, or let's say an acre of ethanol, you can fuel a car 10,000 miles, average American car that runs, but converted 100% ethanol. With an acre of solar panels, you can put it in an electric vehicle and go 1 million miles. 2 orders of magnitude more power is gathered through solar. We are electrifying America right now, both in transportation and heating. This is really, if we're going to be growing fuel or powering vehicles with what we do with our cropland, solar is certainly the best choice.
I would say nuclear generation can get you 93 to 98% efficient. So I think that is very remarkable. I also understand from neighboring farmers that when they do take their corn for ethanol production, they actually also have byproduct that comes from that corn, and they can use that to feed their livestock. So it's not wasted. It affects other areas and provides a resource for other things other than just electricity.
I spent about 4 years trying to determine what to do with the nation's nuclear waste at the U.S. Department of Energy. We have never disposed of a single spent fuel rod in the United States. They're all sitting there on pads. I'm pro-nuclear. I think we need to solve the waste problem before we talk about more. And secondly, we've got to get a way to build it without waiting 25 years from the time you conceive of it. So it's great to talk about, but it is so far out that it's not going to do much for our current energy needs, and solar can move relatively quickly.
The waste is also.
I want to give Justin a chance to speak. I saw you were trying to get something in there.
Yeah, you guys are both right on a lot of factors, right? But I think where it's societally where we get hung up on is this concept of either or, and in reality, the answer is both, right? If we think about the land that's being used for the Duane Arnold solar project, right? That is less than 1% of the land in all of Lynn County. And if we think about that in all of Iowa, it is less than 0.002% of all of the land in Iowa. And as we think about where does it go, right? Where do we see this from here? We're going from essentially 0% of large scale solar in Iowa to some amount of large scale solar in Iowa. Solar is one of the solutions, but it is not the only solution for electricity on the overall power grid. It is part of this diverse mix of resources. Solar has really good benefits in that it comes without emissions. It comes with a lower overall operating costs, which customers end up paying for. So that's a great thing for customers because there are fewer moving parts, fewer people needed to do that. So you can spread your resources across more projects and lower your overall cost per unit. It doesn't use water, so there are no water withdrawals. And it actually, what we see is cleans the water systems in areas because we're preventing different herbicides and pesticides and nitrogen from being inserted into the ground, which sometimes runs off and whatnot. So it's not an either or, it's an and we're going from zero to some amount. And so that's where we're trying to understand, what does that some amount look like? Part of the topic of this session here is these myths that we wanted to work through, and one of them, Sarah, you did bring it up, was about 8,000 or so acres signed here in Lynn County. Without being in control of those 8,000 acres and not knowing what's happening with them, what I can say is a lot of times when we develop solar projects, we will sign up a lot of acres to understand what is possible to build, but then what ultimately gets built and used is just a fraction of that. And so it's hard to get because you see this large number on what gets signed up, but what actually gets used once we're through the entire process is just a fraction of that.
Are you saying you're done after project 1 and 2?
I have no control over project 1 and 2. Those are not my company. So I can't speak for that. I can speak generically though.
I did a quick calculation recently, and if we close down all other forms of power generation used in the state and we only build solar, it would take something like 0.68% of the land in Iowa to power, the cropland in Iowa to power it. This is not going to be a field after field of solar. We also have huge grid congestion problems in the nation and in Iowa, which greatly limits the number of projects that can be built. When we started working on the solar triangle, we looked at sites everywhere out of the wind belts, all the way across South Iowa and up to East Iowa. There are very few sites that there is transmission infrastructure to site a large project on. So just because of the grid congestion, it's going to self-limit.
What we're doing here locally on the western side of Lynn County is making up for that 640 megawatts, right? That's already something that can be utilized. And when you think about how much land it takes for a megawatt, and let's just use a round number of, or an easy number is 5, and you equate that out with 640 megawatts, you're at 3,200 acres to try to recoup that. But if you also calculate in a 20% efficiency factor, if your goal is to get 640 output, you're going to need to build 5 of these facilities, which would be 16,000 acres to recoup that total megawatt generation that you're after. And so it's just the landmass piece of it. You can put solar on anywhere. And I just, it's unsettling that we're in this situation of, it's either solar or agriculture. And I think that there needs to be a lot more open discussion, both with rural community residents and energy companies, to understand how do we find and work together to find a better solution, because what's happening now is not a good solution.
It 18 and 20%. So what we're seeing now for most large scale systems is in the mid 20s for capacity factor. Improvements in technology and whatnot. Earlier systems, yes, had 18%. That's very accurate. But what we're seeing nowadays is in the low to mid 20s. for capacity factor. Then finally, the system works is so if there are 600 megawatts to be replaced, when you are able to size a project for that, you are not, the capacity factor does not play into the size of the project that you're able to install. So you would design 600 megawatts of whatever resources you're doing, and it wouldn't be 600 times 4 because it's only at the 25% capacity factor, right? That's not how the calculations work. So,
but then if you're not building those additional facilities, then what you're trying to replace, you're at a negative because you're not producing the same amount of power like you were. So you're in a deficit. I know our state of Iowa is an exporter of electricity. So I do know that we consume less than we produce. And I would say the 18%, I did pull that from the EIA website for Wapello, which has been online for 1 year. So it is a little old, it's a year old, but it gave us 18%.
I love the idea that you can build solar anywhere, and boy, have I tried. My company, Megawatt, originated the largest urban solar project in the United States as of about 2018, 13 megawatts in Los Angeles. We've looked at every urban area, sort of former industrial blighted area, urban area from Buffalo to St. Louis. We spent years working with the city of Detroit trying to build urban infill solar. They've got 40 square miles of vacant lots and vacant buildings in Detroit. If there's anywhere you should be able to do it, it's there. It is extremely difficult, and it is not an efficient use of both solar panels or the resource. It would take about 40,000 average rooftop systems to equate what we're doing with produce as much power as we're powering with the Johnson County Solar Triangle. I took a look, Iowa City on the 2010 census only had 29,000 residences. That includes dorms and apartments. A lot of rooftops are not suitable for solar. They'd have to be redone. It would take, as long as it takes to site a nuclear power plant, I believe, to get to 150 megawatts in any urban area in Iowa would take far longer than that.
We've gone over some of the things I want to talk about, which are the reasons that people say that they may oppose solar, including that using land for solar panels isn't the best use of Iowa's land, and that putting solar panels on roofs and parking lots is a viable alternative. I know, Sean, you just addressed that. Another reason I wanted to address is people say that solar panels are too expensive. What is your take on that, panelists?
So the cost of solar has really come down in the last decade or so, to be now on par with other forms of generation. So nuclear, while it is a stable resource, it is by far it is by far more expensive than other options, especially new nuclear. So it is, as we'd said, number one is reliability. Number two is cost and emissions. So what we try and do is make sure that we've got resources that are reliable, that both fit the cost profile and the emissions profile that our customers demand. So what we're seeing right now is that solar energy is on par and with other forms of generation. In addition, it doesn't have a fuel component like natural gas or coal does. And right now, if anybody remembers their winter energy bills from last year, we saw, near record high costs for natural gas. And so the more that we can remove that fluctuating component from it, the more certainty that customers have on their energy bills moving forward.
I would say on the price point side of it being expensive, I would agree that it is less expensive for the utility to operate, but it is going to cost Iowans more money in their electric bill. Currently, Alliant customers are paying the $110 million power purchase agreement buyout that happened in 2018. And what I understand, the Iowa Utilities Board, there is a rate making case where Alliant is already petitioning to raise rates to pay for these facilities. And I think the last—
That's not true, actually. That's not true.
I have the RPU 2021-0003, if anybody wants to take a look at that.
That is not a request to raise rates. I want to be very clear on that. That is not a request to raise rates. As a regulated industry, we are required to get approval on spend for projects. The approval and required spend does not directly correlate with rates. So I just want to be very clear on that. I'm not saying that rates will go up. I'm not saying that rates will go down, but I wanted to make it clear that what we have going right now is not a request to raise rates. That is exactly what it is not. It is to set rate principles for the projects and to set an overall budget cap.
There are large employment businesses here in Cedar Rapids and around Iowa who have concern about this current case petition, in that, they are concerned, especially about the battery system and the cost of that ratepayers will incur. So I think there's a lot to talk about there. There's a lot of interesting things happening at the Iowa Utilities Board. So if those in the audience who are curious, can jump out there. It's all public. So
there will continue to be the need for electric power generation. People are going to use more power with electric vehicles and with electrification of home heating than they have before. Our fleet of power plants is old and dirty nationwide, and the utilities are doing a great job of trying to clean that up. The cheapest way to develop new generation is either by offshore wind, and as much as I like to think Iowa is, bound by water on both sides, you can't do offshore wind here, and solar power, utility scale solar power. So if we want to create more power or replace existing generation, solar is the most viable option for Iowa, as much of the prime areas for wind have been built out already. So solar is the future. Fortunately, it takes very few acres to produce a lot of power. We were talking before about 1 megawatt of power. Well, 1 megawatt of power is all the power used by 230 houses in Iowa. That is really a great use of if we use your number, 5 acres, Sara. So I think we've got an exciting future with solar ahead of us.
Sara, you did bring up about the payment made to exit the contract with the nuclear facility. You're right. Yes, that was made, and yes, customers are paying it. Customers are benefiting though, because by exiting that contract early, we are able to save our customers $300 million over the life of the contract. So that is a business decision that we made to enter that contract, but exiting that contract has no correlation into NextEra's decision on what to do with that facility. So I just want to make it clear that yes, we did make that payment. We made it, of course we did, but it also saves our customers $300 million over the course of the rest of that contract.
I will clear a little bit there. There is a correlation. It's in a testimony filing with the IUB by an IPL employee that there was an understanding that if you terminated your power purchase agreement, that the plant would close. That's public record.
Yeah, that wasn't our decision. That's what I'm saying.
I would also say that that instead of fuel payments, we do have land payments. And I would say that land lease payments are something that you're not, in the VAT, the amount of land that is being leased is a lot more massive than what other generation facilities would need. And so that across the life of whether the facility is operational for 20 or 30 years, I would consider that an equivalent to a fuel expense. So it's not that it's all free. You are paying landowners to use their land, and we do have infrastructure, and yes, I'll just stop there.
Without getting too deep into it, the fuel costs are paid by customers as a separate component of the bill. The lease payments are not; those are calculated differently. So that is different. As being a regulated business, our rate making is very complicated. So it is not the same as a fuel cost for that. Last thing I'll say,
the customer will pay for it.
No, actually, the utility does. So what I will say is we keep coming back to this 5 megawatts or 5 acres per megawatt and whatnot. You're right. Each generation resource that a utility uses has different trade-offs. Some come with more dense energy, some come with less dense energy. What we see is that opportunities with more dense energy also come with higher environmental impacts, higher emissions, higher water usage, and those with less dense, less dense energy production come with lower overall environmental impacts, lower emissions, lower water usage. So it is a trade-off, and it is important to recognize that there are those trade-offs.
I wanted to pivot a bit since we're nearing the end of our session. We've talked a lot about some conflicts between solar interests and agricultural interests. The Gazette recently reported that agrivoltaics, which is when solar panels are placed on top of crops, may be a viable solution for solar and agriculture conflicts. Do you guys think that that is a viable option? And what other types of solutions do you see for bridging the divide between those two interests?
I would like to see better collaboration with agriculture and solar facilities. When you think about it was mentioned before, the percentage of Iowa's land or the percentage of Linn County's land. What I'm seeing is a little different perspective is that, all of this is concentrated over on the western half of Linn County. And so when you're looking at that from a farmer's perspective, if I'm a farmer leasing land, that's a big impact for me because now all of the land that was available to lease for my farm is no longer available. It impacts the small agricultural businesses like our grain storage facilities, seed sales, all of that stuff with the small communities. It's going to have a negative impact. So I'd like to see better balance and conversation with that. Those conversations haven't happened. I also would like to see the county or even utilities try to utilize land that is less prime farmland, for it to be land that is less suitable for growing crops and for farming, as opposed to some of the more prime high CSR rated soils.
I had a farmer come to me the other day and ask if for some of these counties that are considering restrictions like that, does that mean that he can never put his high CSR land into rotation or into reserve, or that he could never not grow crops on it and instead grow livestock or bale hay or create a hunting area where he would have natural prairie? And so those are the questions that we're seeing when we start to talk about forcing different use of land based upon the land profile of that, as opposed to what the landowner wishes. So that is definitely something that we're seeing as being talked about. Back to the question about agrivoltaics, I think that is a rapidly growing industry and discussion, and that everybody is. I know from Alliant and from others as well. Everybody's looking to understand the possibilities and the potentials that come with that. I saw that there are different groups that are able to bring in sheep to graze on the land underneath. And so while that's not row crop, that is definitely agriculture. And so it's exciting to kind of see where that will take us. If there's any place that it's going to succeed, it's got to be here in Iowa.
That'll be interesting to see sheep. I think that's only right now in California, where they're doing that at a few facilities. I know there's a lot of people who are advocating for the projects that would like to see that happen.
Sean, I want to give you some space to speak to.
Well, Iowans have done a great job of evolving their farms to fit the latest technology and what's happening in the markets. And if you look at the small amount of land that will ever be used for solar, spending a lot of time on agrivoltaics to me seems to be a sideshow. When we site an ethanol plant, we don't decide, say, can we plant corn right up to the edge of the rail track or the rail yard, right? That's the new way we're using our farmland to create energy. The additional cost, if you wanted to be able to get equipment under single axis trackers, which are the standard now, that follow the sun around, of the much higher posts, the lack of stability you'd create by the higher posts for the small amount of land that's going to be utilized this way. It's sort of a sideshow question is all I can say. It's not going to produce a lot of crops. It's not going to produce a lot of grazing land. Great, if you can get sheep under there and graze, more power to you, but re-engineering to have a more expensive power supply by creating, basically raising everything up, you're going into the world of parking lot canopy solar, which is about the most expensive way you can produce solar anywhere. So I don't see that it's worth it with that. Probably all that will ever be developed in solar will be less than 1.5% of the land by a considerable amount.
We're nearing our 5-minute mark, so I wanted to turn to some questions from our audience. One of our audience members asked, could the panelists give their opinions on whether they would prefer for the Iowa Utilities Board to adopt statewide siting requirements as opposed to leaving it up to each county? Justin, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, that's a discussion that we're having right now. I don't have a position on that right now because we see, there are definitely pros and cons to both sides of that. So I can't take a position on that right now.
For me, I think it's difficult to answer that as well too. Without having conversations with people on both sides. And I don't mean to say that divisively, but it is, there are very different opinions of people who live in rural communities and people who don't, and to saying what should happen and what shouldn't. So I think that there needs to be some in-depth conversation, not just surface level, to understand what the challenges and on both sides are and work together to try to find a solution. I certainly would prefer that, because each community is different. Western Iowa is different than Eastern Iowa, so it's difficult to apply a blanket code standard for that. And if you do, what gaps are there? So I think it's best for people who are impacted to be invited into that conversation and to start to bring some of those things to light that maybe others may not have thought about yet. And then, you arrive at a better solution because you have, different perspectives trying to work together for a solution.
This is a very well understood industry. It was mentioned earlier that this is a new industry and we've got to think about it. There's thousands of communities across the United States, in states from New York to New Mexico, that have been through the exercise of determining what regulations and what ordinances they need to get through solar. There seems to be a lot of effort to stall out projects by studying things that there's a huge menu of choices out there. It seems to me to be it should be a rapid exercise that doesn't require moratoriums, and it doesn't require the state involved, for a community to pick the choices that are right from them, from what other communities that have been through this ahead of them. Johnson County, where we're working, just finished up a very, reasonable set of solar regulations as an overlay to zoning, and probably every community in Iowa could borrow from that. Whether it's done by the utility board or whether it's done by local governments, I haven't thought through that. But I will tell you, there's some local governments that everybody could learn from. There's a real temptation in many areas of American life to study and stall. We need to think this through. We've got to reinvent the wheel. We got to slow down, what's happening. I think I know solar is mature enough nationally that there's no reason to create more difficulty getting through zoning process or create whole new ones when there's many of them out there if you look nationwide.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience, which is, what is done with spent solar panels? Are there any environmental concerns?
I think I would challenge to understand what they infer by spent. The solar panels have a long life to them, and utilities normally depreciate them over a period of 30 years. At the end of 30 years, they still have significant performance in the between 80 and 90% efficiency. So it is not accurate to think that once they're done with the utilities depreciation and performance expectations for them, that they're not usable anymore. And there's a growing secondary market right now on these because we have businesses and consumers who want to purchase these panels that have still strong output after they are done.
So I understand based on applications that we've read that the solar panels will end up in either in the landfill or recycling. It's $30 to recycle a solar panel versus $2 to dispose of it in the landfill. This project here, I believe, Justin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's over 300,000 solar panels for project 1 and 2. That's a lot of solar panels. And the other thing too, that we need to consider, which is part of, the discussion with ordinances that, yes, I think, if everything goes right and everything's perfect and we don't have a situation, then, yeah, we don't need to understand the gray area, but we need to understand the gray area with liability because, our area has seen derechos and seen significant damage. Once solar panels are broken, or any product rather that's broken and not used as it's intended, now falls within RCRA guidelines. And, there is lead solder in solar panels. I don't know what the impact is. We've decided to remove lead from paint. We can't use that anymore. So just trying to understand, like, when the product is not utilized as it should, or it's destroyed and it's in the landscape, what is the cost to dispose of that? What are the things that people should be precautious of? And is there an area that would take 300,000 solar panels? I'm not sure.
Well, we have reached the end of our hour. So I wanted to thank the panelists for engaging in this discussion, and thank you for all who attended online. The next session in our energy and environment track is about electric vehicles and local utility grids, and that will begin today at 2:10 p.m. We hope you can attend, and everyone have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.